I sat in front of a kid, 12 to 13, and his older sister, who I assume was his guardian. It was a cross-country flight, and the kid was casually talking about how he had never flown before and he is looking forward to it. He seemed likely on the spectrum a bit. It is pretty wholesome so far. Then the plane starts to move and he instantly freaks all the way out, screaming, "We are all going to fucking die. Let me off this plane, it's a fucking coffin, you're all going to die. It's going to be a fucking fireball," etc. The stewardess comes by and tries to calm him down. The sister is talking to him in English and Spanish, trying to get him to relax, telling him he is embarrassing her, she's never taking him to Puerto Rico if he keeps acting like this, etc. The guy in front of me turns around and loudly offers the kid Xanax. Finally, the hero of the story, a big southern black lady says, "James," not his name, "honey, I'm gonna need you to calm down, sweetie, cause you're making all the rest of us real nervous now, okay?" Eventually, and for no noticeable reason, the kid relaxes and starts talking about how cool flying is. Like a switch, he starts looking out the window, saying things like, "Wow, the view is really cool. I feel safe now, everything is okay after all." Audible collective sigh of relief. Where was his sister flying him to? Astronaut camp. I think about him every time I fly. I am a pilot for a major airline. Decades ago I was running for a deadhead flight home and managed to snag the last seat. My mother and young daughter were seated next to me. Halfway through the flight, the mother, seeing my disheveled look after flying all day, asked if I wanted her daughter's PB&J sandwich that she wasn't going to eat. I politely declined, but she insisted. That was the best peanut butter and jelly sandwich I'd ever had. Not something I overheard, but something semi-interesting nonetheless. I once went and got sushi with my mom and I noticed a guy and a girl at another table very clearly on their first date. They were both dressed very nice, lot of awkward laughter, the guy was being ultra gentlemanly, like pulling her chair out for her. You know, just the usual stuff that tips an observer off that they were still very much getting to know each other and wanting to make a good impression. Fast forward 2.5 years. I was boarding a plane in Atlanta, Georgia, heading to Colorado with my brother to go skiing when I saw the same couple seated near the back of the plane. I was in the row directly in front of them, so when I put my bag up, I turned to them and said, "This is going to be super weird, but did you guys have your first date at insert sushi restaurant?" They both got wide-eyed in shock and laughed and told me that they had in fact had their first date there. I told them I was there that night and just happened to recognize them when I boarded the plane. It was friendly and we chit-chat for a bit. They were going skiing at the same place we were, so it was cool and all. Day 2 of our trip, my brother and I decide to go to the top of the mountain and take a few of the more advanced slopes down to the bottom. There were maybe a dozen or so people up there, and before taking off we decided to look at the trail map to make sure we were going to get back to where the shuttle could pick us up without having to hike our gear for 2 miles. About 20 feet away from us, a guy got down on one knee and proposed to his girlfriend, and everyone clapped as she jumped up and down with excitement and said yes. They took off their helmets and goggles to kiss, and it was the same freaking couple. I literally was there for their first date, met them for the first time on a plane purely by chance because I was sitting in front of them, and was present when he proposed to her. I assume they're still married because at the rate we're going, I'm probably going to run into them again if one of them decides to file for divorce. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been facing some strong headwinds and it appears we burned up a little more fuel than we anticipated, so we will be making a diversion to Fiji. This was flying from the US to Australia in a 747. I had seen on the trip map that we had been flying in the wrong direction for like 2+ hours. When we did land, we landed hard and they told us that because of the landing we had to sit on the ground with the engines off in Fiji in the summer while technicians looked at the plane. When we were airborne again, our destination was fogged out and we diverted from Sydney to Melbourne. I don't ever want to spend 26 hours on a plane again. 2 older guys in my row on the way to an academic conference. One of them mentions that the first thing he is doing is attending lecture on some esoteric physics topic, but before he can even finish the name of the topic, guy number 2 says, "Oh, of course, the effects of co-limited tesseracts on quantum membrane string interactions, or some such physics jargon. Are you familiar with the topic?" Guy number 1 gets halfway through saying, well actually I dash, before he is cut off by guy number 2 who says, because, you see, most people, even in the field, are woefully undereducated in this particular subject. And then proceeds to talk guy number 1's head off for about 10 minutes. Guy number 1 just nods and smiles patiently through the whole exchange. At the end of his missive, guy number 2 says, so, the lecture is being given by Dr. So-and-so, one of the leaders in the field, an absolute legend. Do you know his work? And, of course, guy number 1 puts on a very kind but somewhat sheepish look and says, actually, I am Professor So-and-so, your understanding of the field is actually quite good. Guy number 2 turns red as a tomato for a few seconds, but seemed to get over it quickly, and they spent the rest of the flight casually talking shop about theoretical physics. I was flying to Seattle from Atlanta, and there was a baby crying for the majority of the flight. The parents were doing their best, and it really was not their fault, just a shitty situation. About halfway to Seattle, the man seated in front of the baby snapped and started screaming at the baby and his parents, cursing at them, saying how they're awful parents and he's gonna beat them all, including the baby, to a pulp when they land. A flight attendant tried to ask the guy to calm down, and he said he would also beat her up. The pilot had to come on and tell everyone to calm down, or else we had to make an early landing. We made it to Seattle, and the guy ended up having to be tackled by 4 cops at the gate because he was trying to run away after being approached by them. One time on a flight, I got on really buzzed, sat next to this girl who struck up a conversation with me. She was going to Oregon to join what any reasonable person would notice was a cult. She described the whole thing to me: give up belongings, worship, and work together to build a commune. I as soberly as I could told her to just be really careful that it sounds like a cult, to keep her wits about her and leave if she felt in any way uncomfortable. Some religious lady in front chimed in and started saying she is just finding her Lord and Savior and I have no right. Spent the better part of that flight in a really weird fight to save this girl from a cult. I'm sure someone overheard this, and it must have been the weirdest thing they have heard on a flight. Maybe it was none of my business, and maybe I shouldn't have got into this on a flight, but drunk me felt it was my duty to save her. I was sitting next to a dad and his daughter who was about 5. He was super cool and was chatting away while his daughter started talking to me. She was so sweet and bubbly, and gave way too much information to me. She said something along the lines of, I went to my grandma and grandpa's house and they're married. I wish my dad would marry my mom, but they can't talk to each other, but I always wish they were married like my grandma and grandpa. Her dad would have been horrified. And I was just sad. Way too late for anyone to see this, and it wasn't so much overheard as said to me. I was flying alone and this little girl, maybe 5, wandered down the aisle and said hello. I asked where her parents were and she said they died and a police officer was flying with her to take her to her aunt. My brain was not able to conjure any response at all apart from air. Sorry, she asked if she could look out my window, so I moved over to the aisle seat and let her, me continuously looking for a cop that she might be traveling with. She then told me how her parents were driving back from a party last week and their car got pushed off the road by a truck into a tree. She was quietly crying while telling me this story. Suddenly I hear, "Oh, there you are," from the aisle. There's a woman standing there. The girl says hello mommy and leaves with her. Not that crazy, but a fun story. Last December I was flying from Frankfurt to Chicago and was seated in the absolute last row of the plane where the staff prepares stuff so you can hear them just chatting with each other. Right before takeoff I heard one of the flight attendants say to another, "Is that thing still broken?" I swear they'll never get around to repairing it, which is not something you want to hear on a flight. The guy next to me was like, "Did you hear that?" looking at me like, WTF, I hope nothing major is broken. The attendants then said something like, "Well, at least it's not maggots this time," and me and the guy next to me were thoroughly concerned about how this flight would go. After laughing it off, I spent the next 9 hours chatting to this complete stranger about our entire lives, relationships, family drama, etc. We had 4 glasses of wine and decided to watch The Matrix together, making sure to pause whenever the other person paused. I don't think we exchanged names, but if you're out there, guy from Wisconsin living in Italy and teaching English, thanks for the most fun flight I've ever had. Oh, I got this one. Passenger W is struggling to get his luggage into the overhead compartment and passenger E seated next to me starts getting upset. W's carry-on clearly doesn't fit. He speaks up saying to be careful because his luggage is there. Flight attendant comes over and says passenger W needs to check his bag. W grows increasingly disturbed, but it works out. Then W says to the flight attendant, "I'm sorry, it's just that I haven't taken my medication. I get so nervous with all these body bags on board. You know I have body parts in my luggage." Passenger E turns to me and says, "Did you hear that? I just have a laptop in my luggage." Sitting next to a young woman and her boyfriend on a flight about to depart to San Diego. They were going for a romantic getaway, and apparently she decided to find God on the way to the airport. What did that mean? Well, she decided that they weren't having any more sex until he married her, but kissing, hand-holding and other PG-rated intimacy were perfectly okay. Boyfriend tried his best not to flip out, but you could tell he was very agitated. An hour later we're in the air and they're both awkwardly sitting there without saying a word. She gasps and starts crying rather loudly. Apparently he logged into the plane's Wi-Fi, canceled the hotel and booked himself a turnaround flight home. Pretty sure they were done as well. The absolute mayhem that broke out when the captain announced that we were in fact not going to get to take off because of night air traffic restrictions at our destination after we had been sitting and waiting in the aircraft for 2 hours already. That entire evening was just a great mess. First we had to wait for a flight attendant who was called from standby, then we finally got to board the plane, but apparently the airline had a severe ground staff shortage so there was no one to get the luggage onto the plane. When the luggage was there we didn't have a tow. Then the captain told us we wouldn't get landing clearance at our destination but that we couldn't deplane either, because, well, ground staff shortage, and the only guy who was allowed to attach the jet bridge was busy with other planes, so we sat there for another 2 hours. Absolute horror for the flight attendants, cause people were raging and didn't understand that the airline employees PN the plane had nothing to do with rescheduling / compensation / or the reasons for this mess in general. I actually kinda enjoyed the whole thing. Turned out to become a little adventure. I got to transfer to another airport in the city, spent the night there and flew out with a better airline the next morning, paid by the original airline plus cancellation compensation, but man, poor flight attendants. Once I was flying between 2 Australian cities, and there were a bunch of highly manicured young men sitting in front of me. They looked somewhat familiar, but I couldn't place them. Naturally, I spent the entire flight trying to figure out who they were, mostly by looking between the seats while they were texting their friends. I saw them write a bunch of messages to mates about how much they didn't want to hang out with us and they just spend all their time in their rooms. It wasn't until we landed and I walked out into a room of screaming teenage girls, signs and selfies at the ready, that I placed that we'd been sitting directly behind 5 Seconds of Summer, an Australian boy band which was reaching popularity at the time. I can only assume they were texting about the band they were touring with, a little-known outfit called One Direction. Sitting on a plane in Chicago, waiting for takeoff. There was a delay, so the guy across the aisle was talking on his phone, very loudly. He looked familiar. AMD was wearing a hat from a company in my hometown. I end up overhearing his entire conversation in which he proceeded to shit-talk my brother, whom he indirectly works with. We were over 500 miles from home. He was using full names, details that couldn't be misconstrued. It was hilarious. I wanted to call him out on it, but he looked a lot crazy, so I kept quiet. Cleared to land, any runway. On a United flight on Thanksgiving 2 decades ago, listening to from the cockpit, after our transcontinental flight had a duck go through an engine at our dawn takeoff from an airport, Sacramento, California, surrounded by wetlands. There was smoke in the cabin and the pilot had declared an emergency. Ground control didn't respond at first, raising the question of whether the bird had first hit something else and damaged the radio. Postscript, we landed fine, met by emergency equipment, and were towed to the gate. Our flights were auto-rebooked before we could get off the plane. Our re-rebooked flight was direct to our destination region, making up for the later departure, although involving a little more driving in the snow. Not exactly overheard, but I had a guy sit next to me on a plane when I was about 14 and he was absolutely sloshed. He even told me he went to just about every bar in the airport before the flight, and then let me know all about some wedding he was going to. He even asked me for some of the candy I was eating. But the best part was that he let me know the wedding gift he was bringing was a hummingbird carcass, and that he had a machete in his suitcase. It turned out he was in the wrong seat, by the way. The plane had not even taken off and he managed to tell me all this before he was moved. Two guys who had joined the Poo Mile High Club congratulating each other on a successful mission. One of them was already in the Wank Mile High Club. Other than that, flying into Stockholm in winter, the pilot said we're approaching a mild storm and could encounter some turbulence. As he finished the sentence, the plane violently shuddered and dropped, what I imagined to be, about 20 feet in a second, triggering the oxygen masks to fall from the overhead displays. I joined the Poo Mile High Club in that moment. It was gut-wrenching. But, the only turbs we actually experienced, the rest of the descent into Stockholm was rather smooth. Was recently behind a pair of drunk parents and an 11 to 12-year-old son with headphones. They were connecting to a week-long reunion with her family and I hope they survived it. She was telling him to just give her money and leave so he could go be with his young girls in Italy. Two highlights were him pulling his son's headphones off and saying, "You need to hear this. I'm only with these girls because your mother stopped loving me and they're better than she ever was," and her saying, "My dad keeps asking to kill you and I'm going to tell him now is the time. No one will find you and no one will even care except the girls you spend so much on." Was on a flight to Manchester, during a storm, after a long flight from SE Asia via Saudi. The landing was horrible, the plane smacked into the runway, bounced 2 or 3 times and started skidding sideways before the pilot finally regained control. I was sitting in the back row. They say that if you're ever scared of flying, look to the flight attendants for reassurance. I don't have a fear of flying, but this landing shook me up. It clearly shook up the cabin crew also. As soon as we were safe and during the entire taxi to the terminal, the attendants in the galley behind me were having a very audible conversation about your chances of dying in a crash landing. If it crashes when landing it explodes and we're all dead was one of the misinformed gems I overheard. Haven't flown with Saudia since. Listen to a guy on a 3-hour flight try to lure an underage girl, headed for LA, to be a singer, into giving her a ride to her friend's place, that he definitely knew what part of town it was in. I listened to him talk about all his music connections and how he could help her career, and then slowly transition into how he and his wife had an open relationship and how everyone in LA was totally cool with multiple partners. Anyways, long story short, I waited at the end of Jetway when we landed, they walked out, he went to make a phone call and I walked up to her and said, "Hey, I know this is none of my business but I have a very bad feeling about the man you've been sitting next to and I think you should call an Uber. Do not get in his car with him, you don't know him." She looked at me terrified and said, "What do I do?" We called her an Uber, he looked over and gave me an extremely dirty, super creepy look, and walked away. I waited until he exited the airport and made sure she got an Uber. TLDR, potentially helped make sure an aspiring singer didn't get kidnapped.